Hi everyone, welcome to the next episode. I'm not sure which is this, but this is going to be like a bonus episode actually. So we're going to do a bit of refactoring. So in our previous video, what we did was we worked on our CLI helper. We added um, a few functions. One to read from the console in a way that we can provide a label and also specify if that value you want to read is required. So kind of like required field. So if we set it required to true, okay, it means that we will keep forcing you to provide that value and we won't accept blank values. Okay, but if it's true, but if it's false, then even if you don't put anything, it would go through. Okay, we also created a right line function, which is basically our echo with echo followed by the value and just an end line. Okay, just making it convenient for us to use. Okay, and then we have our render form function, which was created to help us handle forms. So we're going to have a way we get multiple values or multiple inputs rather. Okay, for example, our sign up form, okay, for our app or our login form. Okay, we need to collect multiple inputs, so we wanted a way to provide a list of values or a list of form requirements, okay, that we can provide and then create a form with it. So this is an example. We specify the keys we want for the form. So here we are saying we want name, we want pin, we want email, we want password, and then we can, for each field, we can specify some configuration for them. So this is label. So label, we are saying name, and it's required true. So if it's required, we'll force you to provide that value. If it's false, we won't force you to provide, or won't will allow you to provide an empty value. And also, if you don't provide an is required configuration param, then we would just set it as false. We'll assume it is false if you don't specify this manually. We also did some validation so that you must provide a label. Okay, and we did some checks to handle that. Okay, so just to give a bit of demo. Okay, let's see. CLI. Let's do this. And you can see we have name with name as the label, and because we set required to true, we must provide that value. So if I try to skip it, it will always prompt me with this error and I have to provide a name. So let's say Andromedas, and then pin, because pin I didn't specify is required, it assumes it as false by default. Okay, and then email, and you can see for every required field there is this extra label here that tells you, okay, it's a required field. So if I don't provide, it keep asking me to provide. So let me just put this, and then password is required, so I can put this, and then we have our value. So by default, for fields that you don't set, that you set as required false, or you don't set the is required configuration parameter, it just sets it as null. If you don't provide a value, it makes it easier for us to work with. So this is going to be a slight refactoring. So let's go through form config or our render form function. You can see that one, we can improve this a bit. Okay, so if you look at our parameter here, it's accepting an array of form configuration, okay, which is basically just an associative array, and you can see there's a lot of validation. One, to check if the array is empty. If it's empty, well, there is no form field specified, so there is no point to entering a form because there is no field to render. Okay, but if there is at least one value in this form configuration, we do a lot of work to check to see if that value one is an associative array. So that's the first check we do. Sorry. And then we also do, what do we do? Hold on a bit. Alright, I'm back. Sorry about that. Okay, so what's next? So we check if that value is a configuration object. Okay, so this is where we do the validation here. So first check to see if a label exists. If it doesn't exist, then we return null. Okay, but if it does, then we set the label, and then we also check to see if the label is empty. So we don't want to make sure that you don't provide an empty label. Yeah. Right. So if any of the validation fails, we return null. Okay, we print the sorry, I don't know what's wrong with my voice. So we print the sorry. So we print the value. Okay. Or we print the error rather. Okay, that's the error that occurred, and then we return null. This will signify that something went wrong. Okay, during processing of this form configuration rather. You can see our return type is an array or null. So when rendering the form, we would want to check. We can do a check to see if that data is null. So if it's null, then we are sure that it wasn't successful. Okay, so validate the label here. Okay, once we do that, we also check to see if the is required parameter was specified as part of the configuration. Okay, if it is specified, if it's not specified, we set it as false. If it is, then we check to see if that value is a Boolean variable. If it is, we use that value, else we just set it as false. So we don't want to fail if you put the wrong value as is required. And then we trim the label to make sure there's no white spaces, and also set we get whatever we set as is required, and then create a new clean validation configuration item. Okay, for this particular configuration, so we're setting it to we're setting the, can see we have this object here. Okay, this empty array. So anytime we validate the form configuration, we'll set clean data and store it into this array here. Okay, so we're setting the key for this new entry as the field, that's name of the field provided, and we're also setting the configuration data. Okay, there. And once we're through, we start rendering the form. So we have our form data. We go through all the valid form config, and then we set. So anytime we receive a value, anytime we encounter a value or an entry or a field in this configuration object, we render it using the readline function, which is basically this, and we provide the configuration dot specify for the field. So here we are setting the label, and we're also setting if it's required or not. Okay, so this will enter the field, and when we get the data, we'll store it in this form data array with the key as the field name. And once we are done, we're going to return that form data back to our caller. So the change we're going to do, or the refactoring, you can see there's a lot of work here to be done. One, using an associative array might lead to us making mistakes. You can see we had to do a lot of validation just to confirm if the keys, label, and is required exist. Okay, there could be a cleaner way to do this. Okay, and also, if you look at where we are specifying the form configuration, we could make mistakes here. We could maybe spell label as label, okay, or we might even forget that field, okay, in total, and it could lead us to wrong values in our configuration or in our forms. So the change we're going to do here is, instead of expecting an associative array as the form configuration, we're going to represent the configuration for the form field as a form field object. Okay, so we'll create a class for this. So let's do that. Okay, so here create a class called form field, and form field is going to have two properties. Okay, so form field string is going to have a label, and then it's going to have bool, which is going to be is required, or we could call it required. Yeah, let's call it required. All right, and we're going to have a constructor for that. So we're going to say function, because we want to make sure that anytime we're creating an instance of form field, we must provide at least a label. But for the required, it's going to make it optional. We want to make it optional. You don't have to provide it. So if you don't provide, we'll use the default value. Okay, so we'll say construct, we'll do string label, and for this we can see bool required equals to false. Okay, and once we get the data, we'll set it. We'll set the label as what we got from label, and then we'll set the required as what we got from required. And we'll also provide getters and setters. So let's do get label, and here we're going to return this label, and then we're going to have so because this is boolean, to say get required might not feel appropriate, okay, especially in the English itself. So I'm going to use, so the common way we represent boolean is required or has value, something like that. Okay, so is required is better, okay, in the tongue than to say required or get required. Okay, since it's boolean, is required makes more sense. That's in terms of the grammar. So let's do required, and I think we're good. So right now we're going to see whenever we are expecting a form field, okay, we will be expecting an array, okay, of an associative array of form field with keys as strings and values as form field objects. So first, let's start with modifying our render form. Since we're expecting an instance of form field here, okay, so we're going to do it like this. So first, this is fine. We're going to validate if there is values in the form config, which is fine. The next thing, for each configuration, so this represents the field, this represents a config object. So we need to check if this value is an instance of form field. Now in PHP, we can do that by doing this. So we can say if config instance of, followed by the name of the class we're expecting. So I want to say if it's an instance of form field, okay, or want to say if it's not an instance of, right? So if we want to say this is not an instance of, we can do this. Yeah. So if not an instance, then we can do this. Can take this and then eliminate this. And since this, at this point, this will be a form field object, okay, we don't even need to validate labels and that. Well, we might want to validate label to see if it's empty. Okay, that's also something we can do as well to make sure we don't have an empty label. And we could do this by either validating it in the constructor, or we could validate it here. So I'll prefer, as soon as you create an instance of this, we want to do our validation for label. We don't want an invalid configuration or an invalid form field to even be specified at all. So we can do that here. So let's see. So this is what we are checking exactly. So let's copy this. And we could do the validation here before assigning it to label. So let's do it here. Okay, so we're saying if label is not a string. We don't need to do this because here we are already validating the type. So we can remove this and we could just leave it as if the label is empty. Let's see, do we have this complete? I think we have too many. Okay, yeah, it's fine. So if this is empty, we don't want to print this, we want to throw an exception here. So we'll print the error message, but want to throw an exception. So we could do throw new say logic exception, which is in PHP, or illegal argument exception. I think we have that. Illegal state exception. Yes, illegal state exception. So let's however, we don't really know the name of the field here. Okay, and that's something we can do. We could say a form field. We could specify the key in this, but let's see, do we specify the key in the form field, or do we leave the key out of the form? I think it's fine having the key as a string outside the form field object. So the form field just represents the config itself. But if you look at the name, form field feels like the field itself, not necessarily the configuration. Okay, so we could call this form field config or form field. Yeah, I think config might be a more appropriate word. So let's do config, right? Okay, so if the label is empty, we're going to try an illegal state exception, right? And we're going to say label cannot be empty, since we know exactly what went wrong here. Okay, all right, so if it is empty, it's going to throw this exception, else it would initialize these fields with the value supplied here, right? And let's see, what else do we do? Okay, so with that out of the way, we don't need this if label exists. We can totally eliminate that. So let's do that. And we also don't need to check this because we are sure that one, we have this property here and it's required in the constructor. Two, we've already typed it as bool, so PHP will ensure that you can only provide a boolean value. Okay, so we don't need this as well. And the only thing we need here would just be to store that config here, right? And then from here we are trying to render the data, so we are saying for each form config as field, that's the key, and value, which will be the config object. So we want to render the form. So because this is no longer an associative array, we'll say config but a form field config object. Okay, yeah, let's correct this. This place with specified form field. Okay, yes, config, right? So here we are saying config, then we say get label, and here we do is required. Yeah, okay, these are getters, so we have to include this. So with that, we've refactored our render form to use a class, okay, to represent the form field itself. Okay, and then now when specifying the form field itself or the form configuration itself, we can do, so this is label name is required true, so let's do new form field config, then we say name and we say true for it's required. So for this one, the label is transaction pin, so we do new form field config, and then because we didn't specify it's required, so we could just pass the label without passing. We don't need to say false because by default it's false, right? So for this email address, so we can do new form field config, and says is required is true, so we're going to put true. All right, and for password, same new form field config, and then is required is true, right? Okay, so let's see if this works as is. All right, so error on line 16. Let's see where we went here. Okay, yes, this is a function. All right, so it works because our configuration is correct, but let's do an invalid configuration. Let's say we provided an empty string as the name. Okay, so we got, okay, so there isn't an illegal state exception, or is it invalid state exception in PHP? Okay, let's do a check. Let's do php.net. Okay, so let's see, is it invalid state or invalid argument? Yes, but there should be state exception. Okay, we don't have that in PHP. Okay, yeah, Kotlin. Sorry, so let's use the illegal argument, right? Legal argument exceptions. Let's see. Arguments exception. Yeah. Alright, so exception is thrown if the argument is not the it's not. So okay, so this is more like a type argument. It's more like the type is not what we expect, but it's not really a type. This will make sense if we didn't provide types. Like if, for example, if we said if we don't do this and we are checking to see if string, we can throw that. Okay, but since we already validated types, then we want to more like tell you that it's not in its right state. Okay, it's not what we want. Okay, so let's see. Only accept integers. Okay, as you can see the example, they didn't specify type here. I know there should be something. Well, let's replace that with the base class, which is logic exception. That would do for now. All right, so let's do that. Beautiful. Okay, so we got this exception label cannot be empty. Great. All right, so let's see. Okay, so that will be all for our slides refactoring. Okay, and yeah, see you guys in the next video.